In 1885, when the frontier town of Silverton tore down its old gallows, the lumber was left to rot, too cursed to touch. But orphan twins Olivia and Emma had $3 and no roof. They bought every stick. As winter closed in, the horrified town watched them build a tiny house from the hanging wood. Then, inside the heaviest beam, they found a message that turned a town's fear into a blessing. Olivia and Emma were 17, twins and orphans in Silverton, a frontier mining town that left the gallows lumber to rot in a field. Everyone said the wood was soaked in bad blood, a curse waiting for whoever disturbed it. But the twins had $3 and no home. Against every warning, they bought it all. As they hammered the cursed planks into walls, the town watched with horror and fascination. What kind of girls would risk their lives for a roof? And what dark secret would reveal before the winter was over? The gallows had stood on the north edge of Silverton for 11 years before they tore it down. A simple structure, nothing grand. A raised platform of heavy oak planks bolted together with iron straps, a crossbeam thick enough to hold a grown man's weight without bending, and a trap door that had been dropped just twice in its history. The last man who stood on it was a drifter named Josiah Crane. Accused of murdering a prospector for a pouch of gold dust, he was convicted in a trial that lasted less than 2 days. 3 weeks later, he was hanged. Months passed before another man confessed to the killing on his own deathbed, clear across the territory in a town called Red Rock. Josiah Crane was innocent. The judge who sentenced him had swallowed his own guilt, the jury avoided eye contact, and the town quietly agreed never to speak of it again. But the gallows remained. A dark monument on the edge of town that seemed to draw the wind toward it and hold the cold longer than any other object in Silverton. Farmers herded their livestock around it. Children were forbidden to play near its shadow. When the town council finally voted to dismantle the thing, the workers used ropes and pulleys so their hands would not touch the wood. They stacked the lumber in a vacant field beyond the livery, and there it stayed. Nobody would buy it. Carpenters hired for new storefronts refused to plane the boards. The town pastor, a stern Scotsman named Reverend McAllister, told his congregation that the wood had absorbed the final breaths of dying men and should be left to rot. Some whispered that Josiah Crane's ghost still clung to the grain like frost. Others simply said the price was too high in other ways. Olivia and Emma had heard every warning. They had also spent the last 6 months sleeping under a leaking canvas lean-to on the abandoned claim their father left behind. A beam collapse in the Silver Queen mine had killed him and their mother, who had been bringing his midday meal 2 years earlier. The twins were 14 then, too young to inherit the claim, too old to be taken in by any family willing to feed themselves first. They survived by washing laundry, mending torn shirts, and occasionally accepting the charity of a widow named Mrs. Hemlock, who ran the boarding house. But charity had limits. The Linta would not survive another mountain winter. The girls had known that since the first frost. So in late September, with the aspen leaves turning gold and the morning air already sharp enough to sting bare fingers, Olivia walked to the field beside the livery and stood for a long time looking at the stacked gallows wood. She was the practical twin. Emma dreamed of a house with bright curtains and a hearth. Olivia thought about structural load and wind shear without knowing the words for either. She ran her hand over one of the heavy oak planks, the surface rough with weathering but solid all the way through. The wood was dense, heavy, old-growth oak cut from forests that no longer existed. Pine boards warped and let the wind through. Oak held. Oak remembered. Olivia found the town clerk, a tired man named Mr. Burgess who kept ledgers in a tiny office behind the assay shop, and offered $3, every coin they had saved from 18 months of washing other people's clothes. Burgess stared at her from across his cluttered desk. His pen hovered above the ledger. "You know what that wood is," he said. It was not a question. Olivia did not answer. She placed the coins on the desk, one beside the other. $3 that caught the weak autumn light through the dusty window. Burgess looked at the money, then at the girl with thin shoulders and short brown hair that never stayed tucked behind her ears. He sighed, wrote something in the ledger and pushed a receipt across the desk. "The Lord keep you," he muttered, though it sounded more like a warning than a blessing. Word spread before Olivia reached the end of Main Street. By the time she returned to the field with a borrowed mule cart, a small crowd had gathered. Not to help, just to watch. Mrs. Haverson, the baker's wife, pressed a handkerchief to her mouth as if breathing the air near the wood might invite calamity. Old Mr. Teller, who had served on the jury that convicted Josiah Crane, stood at the back with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Emma stood at the edge of the field with her arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were wide, her face pale beneath the smudges of dirt. She did not want this house. She had said so that morning. But she trusted Olivia more than she feared the wood, which meant she would carry the planks anyway. The first load was the heaviest. The oak beams that had formed the trap platform were 8 feet long and nearly 4 inches thick. Olivia and Emma wrestled them onto the cart one at a time while the crowd murmured like a disturbed hive. Nobody stepped forward to steady the cart. The axles groaned as the weight settled. The mule, a borrowed beast named Dobbin, flicked his ears and pulled without complaint. 3 trips they made that afternoon, hauling the Gallows across the frozen dirt road to the small plot of land their father had once planned to build on. The foundation stones were still there, half sunk into the earth, a ghost of his unfinished dream. Over the next 3 weeks, the twins built their cabin. Olivia worked with a claw hammer and a borrowed saw, sinking iron nails into oak so dense it sometimes took 4 strikes to drive one home. The densest beams, the ones that had held the trap mechanism, she set as the central roof support and the main floor joists. The lighter planks from the platform decking became wall boards. The crossbeam, the thickest piece of all, 12 feet long and nearly a foot square, became the ridge beam at the peak of the roof. When the twins finally raised it into place using a rope and pulley borrowed from the livery, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. A beam that had once supported the weight of a dying man now held up a roof that 2 orphan girls would sleep beneath. The cabin was small, 12 feet by 16 feet, 1 room, 1 window, a stone fireplace they built themselves from river rock and clay. But it was solid. When the wind blew, the walls did not shudder. When the cold crept down from the mountains, the dense oak held the warmth of the fire longer than any pine cabin Olivia had ever stepped inside. She noticed this on the very first night they slept with walls around them for the first time in 2 years. Emma slept soundly, wrapped in a patched quilt beside the hearth. Olivia lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling beams and listening to the silence. A strange thought settled into her mind, one she did not share with her sister yet. The cursed house was warmer than any house they had ever known, but the town did not see warmth. They saw a monument to death rising at the edge of their settlement. Reverend McAllister prayed publicly for the souls of the twins, as if they were already lost. Gideon Welker, the town blacksmith and a man whose opinions carried weight, refused to sharpen the saw blade Olivia had used, saying he would not touch anything that had cut gallows wood. Even Mrs. Hemlock, who had been kind to the girls, now looked at them with something closer to pity than friendship. When the first true cold snap of December arrived and the temperature plunged far below freezing, the townsfolk gathered in the church to pray for mercy, not just for themselves, but perhaps also for the 2 foolish girls in the cursed cabin. On the 7th night after the cabin was finished, Olivia was roused from sleep by a sound she could not place. The fire had burned low, the embers casting faint orange light across the plank walls. Emma lay still beneath her quilt. Outside, the wind moved through the bare aspen branches with a low, patient moan. Olivia sat up slowly, her breath visible in the cold air near the ceiling. The sound came from above her, a soft, almost human creaking like the beam shifting slightly under its own weight. She looked up toward the ridge beam, the dark shape of the gallows crossbeam spanning the length of the cabin, and in the flickering firelight she saw something that made her heart stop. Letters, carved into the wood. Faint, uneven, nearly invisible in the dim glow. A message that had been hidden by years of weather and shadow, now emerging as the dry winter air pulled at the grain. Olivia stood on her cot and raised the oil lamp closer. She could see the strokes of a blade, the desperate hand of a man with nothing left to lose. The words ran along the entire length of the beam, but the lamp was too weak to read them all. She made out only the final 3 letters before the draft extinguished the flame. ONE. That single word hung in the cold darkness above her like a held breath, and outside, the first hard snow of winter began to fall against the cursed house that had been built from the wood of someone else's death. Olivia did not sleep again that night. She relit the lamp with a splinter from the fire, her hands trembling only slightly, and dragged the heavy wooden crate they used as a table beneath the ridge beam. Emma stirred once, murmured something about the cold, and pulled the quilt tighter. Outside, the snow fell in thick, wet flakes that clung to the window and muffled every sound except the faint crackle of the fire. The cabin felt sealed, separate, a world unto itself. Olivia climbed onto the crate, raised the lamp high, and began to read. The carvings were shallow, made by a blade that had been dull to begin with and wielded by hands that shook. The letters slanted and crowded together in places, as if the man who held the knife had been running from a clock he could not see. But the words themselves were unhurried. They had waited. For 11 years, while sun and rain and the weight of men who did not want to look had worked to hide them, the message had remained. Now, with the dry winter air drawing the wood tight, the grain had opened just enough to reveal what someone had once needed the world to know. Olivia read aloud, her voice barely a whisper, the words falling into the cold dark like stones dropped into still water. I, Josiah Crane, write this on the eve of my death. I did not kill the man they say I killed. I was in the wrong place in the wrong hour and no one would listen. I forgive the men who will hang me. I forgive Judge Morrison and the jury and the town of Silverton. I ask only that God remember my name and that someone someday tell the truth. I am innocent. Let this would be a witness. Let it stand long after I am gone. Let it be warm for someone. The last word was not one but someone. The final letters that had seemed so dark and final were only the trailing edge of a prayer. Olivia lowered the lamp slowly. For a long moment, she simply stood on the crate with the cold seeping through the walls and the snow building on the roof and the weight of a dead man's final plea pressing down on the cabin like a second roof, one made of words. She woke Emma before dawn. Not with the news itself, not right away, but with a bowl of hot oatmeal and a quiet voice that said they needed to talk. Emma sat wrapped in her quilt on the edge of the cot, her feet pulled up beneath her, while Olivia lit a second lamp and held it toward the beam. Emma read the words slowly. Her lips moved. When she reached the final line, her eyes filled and spilled over without a sound. She had been the one who wanted bright curtains. She had wanted a home that felt like safety. Now the central beam of that home carried a message from a man who had died for a crime he did not commit, and something inside her cracked open like a door she had not known was locked. "Do we tell anyone?" Emma asked. Olivia looked at the beam, at the fire now burning low in the hearth, at the snow piling white against the one window. "Not yet," she said. "First we find out everything about Josiah Crane." The search took them through the thin records Silverton had kept and the thicker memories of its oldest residents. The court records were sparse. Josiah Crane, age 34, drifter, no known family in the territory, convicted of the murder of a prospector named Clarence Decker, who had been found bludgeoned on the trail north of town with his gold pouch missing. The trial had lasted 2 days. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The execution followed 3 weeks later, on a gray morning in late March of 1874, with most of the town watching from the frozen ground below the gallows platform. The records said nothing about the later confession, nothing about the dying man in Red Rock, nothing that acknowledged the possibility of error. But the memory of the town was not so clean. Mrs. Hemlock remembered. Sitting in her kitchen with a cup of cold tea, the boarding-house widow told Olivia and Emma things she had never said aloud. She had known Josiah Crane not well but enough. He had come through town a week before the murder looking for work at the stamp mill. He was quiet, she said. Not shifty, just tired. The kind of tired that came from walking too long with too little. When the body was found and a posse went looking, they found Josiah 2 miles north with a cut on his hand and no good explanation for why he had been on that trail. The cut was from a barbed wire fence he had climbed, nothing more, but by then the town needed someone to blame. The jury foreman was Clarence Decker's cousin. The judge was a man who believed that swift justice was better than careful justice. And no one, not one person, had spoken for the drifter with no kin. Then 2 months after the hanging, a man named Silas Trout lay dying of pneumonia in a boarding house in Red Rock, 200 miles away. On his final night, burning with fever and perhaps seeing the fires he believed awaited him, he called for a priest and confessed to killing Clarence Decker during a drunken argument over a card game. He described the gold pouch. He described Decker's walking stick, which had been broken in the fight and which the posse had never found. He knew details no innocent man could know. The priest wrote it all down and sent the letter to the territorial magistrate. The magistrate sent it to Judge Morrison, and Judge Morrison, upon reading it, did nothing. The letter was filed. The town moved on. The gallows stood. But something else happened in the weeks after Josiah Crane's death. The gallows, which had been built by a carpenter from Hartville who had since died, began to acquire a reputation. Men who stood near it felt a chill that was not explained by the weather. The wood never warped or cracked the way pine did. It held snow differently, shedding it in clean sheets while drifts piled against other structures. Some said the ground beneath the platform was always bare, even in the heaviest snow. Others said they heard a voice at night, too faint to make out words. The superstition had its roots not in ignorance but in shared guilt, a collective sense that something had been done that could not be undone, and that the gallows wood was keeping the memory alive. Now that wood was a house, and inside that house the memory was no longer silent. The storm that had begun on the night Olivia found the carving did not pass quickly. For 2 days, snow fell in a steady, windless silence that was almost peaceful. Then the wind arrived. It rolled down from the high peaks and slammed into Silverton with a force that rattled windows and sent loose boards cartwheeling down Main Street. The temperature plunged to 20 below zero and kept falling. Mr. Haverson's flour barrels split from the cold. The livery roof collapsed under the weight of drifted snow. In the mining camp above town, 3 men lost fingers to frostbite before a fire could be built. The winter that had been predicted to be merely hard was becoming something else, something older and more dangerous, the kind of winter that killed people. Through it all, the twins' cabin stood untouched. Not buried, not battered, not trembling. The dense oak absorbed the cold without conducting it, holding the heat of the small fire with an efficiency that Olivia still did not fully understand. The ridge beam, the gallows beam, expanded and contracted so slightly with the temperature that the roof joints remained tight while other cabins leaked. The walls did not sweat frost. The floor stayed dry. While other families in Silverton burned twice the wood to stay half as warm, Olivia and Emma fed their stove with half the wood and slept comfortably. The cursed house was not just warm. It was the warmest little house in town. Reverend McAllister noticed. He could not avoid noticing, because his own roof had buckled under the snow load, and his wife had developed a cough that would not stop. Standing in the church with a dozen shivering families who had come to pray for deliverance from the cold, he spoke of the twins with a voice that mixed anger and fear in equal measure. He called the warmth in their cabin a devil's bargain, a seduction meant to draw the innocent toward darkness. He quoted scripture about houses built on sand and houses built on blood. And slowly, with the patience of frost creeping through a crack, the town began to turn. It started small. The storekeeper, Mr. Ashby, suddenly refused to sell Olivia flour, claiming he was out. Mrs. Haverson stopped buying Emma's mending work without giving a reason. Children who had once been indifferent now threw snowballs packed with gravel at the cabin door and ran away laughing. Then Gideon Welker, the blacksmith, stood up in the saloon one night and said that the twins were not just foolish girls, they were a danger. The gallows had been meant to stand as a reminder of justice. Now it was a house warmed by old sin, and the sin was spreading. The storm, he said, was punishment for the town's failure to burn the wood when it had the chance. The only remedy was to tear the cabin down and scatter the boards where they could do no more harm. Olivia heard the rumors from Mrs. Hemlock, who came to the cabin one evening with a loaf of bread hidden beneath her shawl and fear plain on her face. Snow clung to her boots as she stepped inside and felt the warmth wrap around her. She looked at the fire, at the dry walls, at the two girls who had less than anyone in Silverton, but were now somehow warmer than the rest of them. "They're going to call a town meeting," she said quietly. "Friday night. Welker is pushing for a vote to demolish this place. He says it's for the good of the town." Emma looked at Olivia. Olivia looked at the ridge beam. "Then we'll be at that meeting," she said, "and we'll bring what we found." But before Friday came, the winter delivered another message. A rider from the north arrived on a horse that was half dead from cold, carrying a letter addressed to Silverton. The letter was from a nun at a mission in the Northern Territories, a place called St. Mary's. She had been tracing Josiah Crane's final months, interviewing people who had met him along his wanderings. She had spoken to a trapper who had shared a camp with Josiah on the night of the murder, miles from the crime scene. She had found the walking stick, the one with Clarence Decker's initials carved into the handle, buried in a creek bed near Red Rock. The evidence was now undeniable, and the letter demanded that the town of Silverton acknowledge its error and clear the name of Josiah Crane. The letter arrived on Thursday, the day before the meeting. It was read aloud at the saloon by the town clerk, Mr. Burgess, who had taken Olivia's 3 coins weeks earlier. A silence fell over the men gathered there, the broken silence of a story that could no longer be ignored. Gideon Welker slammed his fist on the table and said the letter proved nothing, that nuns were easily fooled, that the walking stick could have been planted. But his voice was alone now. Others looked at their hands and said nothing. The weight of 11 years shifted quietly, like snow settling on a roof. That night, a second blizzard hit Silverton. This one came from the east, a rare direction that caught the town unprepared. The wind screamed down through the main street and tore the roof off the schoolhouse. Snow buried doorways and blocked chimneys and killed a horse in its stall. The church bell tolled once, then stopped, frozen in place. By morning, the town was buried so deep that no one could walk from one building to another without a rope line and a shovel. The temperature fell to 40 below. Inside the twins' cabin, the fire burned steady and warm. The thick oak walls held fast against the storm. The ridge beam bore the weight of the snow without complaint. And Olivia, standing beneath the carved words of an innocent man, realized something that made her blood run colder than any winter wind. The town was coming for them. Not out of hatred any longer, but out of desperation. Because the cursed house was the only building in Silverton that had not failed. And when people are freezing to death, they will tear down any wall to find the warmth inside. The town meeting was held in the church, because the church was the only building left with a roof large enough to hold the desperate and the cold. The blizzard had not stopped. It had slowed, then gathered itself, then come again, a white rage that erased every familiar shape in Silverton. Ropes were strung between buildings so people could find their way to the outhouse. Children slept in piles beneath every quilt their mothers owned. The saloon had run out of candles. The schoolhouse was a ruin of splintered boards. And through it all, the cabin on the old claim stood whole. Every morning, smoke rose straight from its chimney. Every evening, the faint glow of firelight pressed against its single window. The twins were not merely surviving, they were warm. Gideon Welker stood at the front of the church with his frostbitten hands wrapped in strips of old linen. His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent his life convincing others to follow him. "We are not here to harm those girls," he said to the gathered crowd. "We are here to correct a mistake. That wood is cursed. It has brought this winter upon us. The Lord is testing us, and we have failed." Reverend McAllister stood beside him, his face gaunt, his wife coughing in the front pew. He did not contradict Welker. He merely nodded, as if the nod itself was a prayer. Mrs. Hemlock slipped out of the church before the vote was called. She wrapped her shawl tight and followed the guide rope along Main Street, then broke away into the unbroken snow toward the twins' cabin. The journey took her nearly an hour. When she reached the door, her lips were blue and her hands could barely knock. Emma pulled her inside and set her near the fire. And when Mrs. Hemlock could speak again, she told them everything. The vote was a formality. The decision was already made. The men would come at first light with axes and pry bars. They would take the cabin apart beam by beam, and the twins would be left with nothing but a pile of cursed lumber and an open patch of frozen ground. Olivia listened without moving. Her face was calm in a way that frightened Emma more than any shouting would have. She looked at the ridge beam, at the carved words now fully exposed in the firelight, and she knew what they had to do. "We're going to the church," she said. "Now, tonight." The two girls bundled themselves in every layer they owned and followed the half-buried rope lines back through the storm. Emma carried the oil lamp. Olivia carried a small wooden box that held the only evidence they had besides the beam itself. The letter from the nun at St. Mary's, a written statement from Mrs. Hemlock about what she remembered, and a torn page from an old newspaper that mentioned Sela's Truth's confession. The wind tore at them with fingers of ice. Snow caked their lashes, but they pressed forward, two thin shapes moving through the white dark, until the church doors loomed before them. The doors were heavy. Olivia threw her shoulder against them without knocking. They swung open, and a blast of cold rushed into the sanctuary. Every face turned. The gathering was larger than they had expected. Nearly every family in Silverton was there, huddled in the pews beneath every blanket and coat they could carry. Candles flickered on the altar. The air smelled of wet wool and wood smoke and fear. And there at the front stood Gideon Welker, his hands raised as if to bless the destruction he was about to command. He stopped speaking when he saw the girls. The silence that fell was thicker than any sound. Olivia walked down the aisle, her boots leaving wet prints on the floorboards. Emma followed, the lamp trembling in her grip. When Olivia reached the front, she did not look at Welker or the Reverend. She looked at the people, the faces she had known her whole life, the faces that had let them starve after their parents died, the faces that had refused to sell them flour or repair their saw. The faces that were now ready to destroy the only home they had ever built. And she spoke. "You want to tear down our house because you think it's cursed," she said, "but the only curse in this town is the one you've been carrying for 11 years. She opened the wooden box and held up the letter from St. Mary's. Josiah Crane was innocent. You all know that now. The nun found the real killer's walking stick. She found a witness who saw Josiah miles away when the murder happened. The man who confessed on his deathbed Sela's truth. He gave details no one else could have known. This town hanged an innocent man, and instead of admitting it, you let the truth rot in a file while the gallows stood." A murmur moved through the pews, low and uneasy. Reverend McAllister's face tightened. Welker's hands dropped to his sides, but Olivia was not finished. She set the box down and raised the lamp toward the highest point, where the ridge beam of their cabin would have been if they were standing inside it. "And Josiah Crane left a message," she said. "He carved it into the gallows beam before he died. It's still there. You can come and read it yourselves. He forgave you, every one of you. He forgave the judge, the jury, the witnesses who lied, the town that turned away. He asked only that someone tell the truth, and instead of telling it, you called his wood cursed and left it to rot." The silence now was absolute. Someone in the back pew began to cry, a quiet sound like a child lost in the dark. Welker took a step forward, but Olivia turned to face him directly. "You say the house is evil because it keeps us warm," she said. "But it keeps us warm because it's made of dense old oak, not pine. It's physics, not damnation. The same wood that held a man's weight without breaking now holds a roof without cracking. That's not a curse. That's a gift he left behind. He said let this wood be warm for someone, and it is. It's the warmest little house in this town." Emma, who had been silent the entire time, stepped forward and spoke for the first time. Her voice was small but steady. "We're not witches. We're just two girls with no one, but we have a house that a good man built with his death, and we're going to keep it, not because it's cursed, because it's ours." The room broke into chaos. Some shouted that the girls were lying, that the carving was a forgery. Others demanded to see the beam. A few women, those who had lost children to past winters or who remembered Josiah Crane's quiet face, began to weep openly. Gideon Welker's face purpled with rage, but his voice was no longer the loudest. The certainty had drained from him. The logic he had built his argument upon had collapsed. If the wood was not cursed, if the warmth was just physics, then the town had been about to destroy two orphans' home for nothing. For superstition. For guilt. Mrs. Hemlock stood in the back of the church, still shivering from her journey, and raised her voice above the noise. "I'll go with them," she said. "I'll read the carving myself. So will anyone else who wants the truth." One by one, hesitant and half ashamed, other townsfolk rose. Mr. Ashby, the storekeeper who had refused to sell flour. Mr. Burgess, the clerk who had taken the $3. Even old Mr. Teller, who had sat on the jury that condemned an innocent man, pushed himself to his feet with tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The exodus began. A slow procession of lanterns and shawls and borrowed coats, moving through the still falling snow toward the little house on the old claim. When they arrived, the cabin stood as it always had. Solid, warm, lit from within by the fire Emma had banked before they left. The ridge beam glowed faintly in the lantern light as the townsfolk filed inside, packing the small room until the walls seemed to expand with the press of bodies. Mrs. Hemlock was the first to read it, her lips moving silently as her eyes traced the uneven letters. Then others. One after another, they looked up at the beam and saw the words that had been hidden for 11 years. "I forgive the men who will hang me. I ask only that God remember my name, and that someone someday tell the truth." Let this would be warm for someone. The silence inside the cabin was different from the silence in the church. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a wound finally being cleaned. Mr. Teller dropped to his knees. Gideon Welker, who had followed the crowd with a face like stone, stood in the doorway and did not enter. He stared at the beam for a long time, his breath plumbing in the cold air, and then he turned and walked back into the storm without a word. But the night was not over. The blizzard, which had briefly lulled, came again with a fury that seemed almost personal. The wind screamed through the aspen grove and slammed into the cabin with a force that made the walls groan. The snow fell so thick that the path back to town disappeared in minutes. The families who had come to witness the carving were now trapped inside the cabin, 37 people crowded into a space meant for two. There was no food beyond a pot of cold stew and half a sack of oats. There was no water beyond what they could melt from snow. And outside, the temperature was falling past 50 below, a cold so absolute that it could kill a person in the time it took to walk from the door to the outhouse. The cabin held. The dense oak absorbed the cold without conducting it, the same physics Olivia had explained. The fire burned low but steady, and the body heat of 37 people kept the small room survivable. For 3 days, the blizzard raged while Silverton huddled inside the cursed house. During those 3 days, something changed. The townsfolk who had come to destroy the cabin became its guests. They shared the last of the oats. They took turns sleeping in shifts on the floor. They listened to Emma hum old songs their mother had taught them. And they looked at the carving on the beam, over and over, until the words no longer seemed like a dead man's plea but a living thing. A thread that connected one small house to a truth that had been waiting 11 years to be spoken. On the third morning, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a pale, bitter blue, and the sun glittered on the endless white. The families emerged one by one, blinking in the light, and walked back through the deep snow to their own damaged homes. But they did not return as the same people who had left the church. Something had shifted. The cabin that had been built from the wood of an unjust death had become a shelter not just for 2 orphan girls but for the whole town. And in that shelter, they had finally read the message they had refused to hear for over a decade. A week later, when the snow had settled enough for work to begin, a group of men returned to the cabin, not with axes, with a polished oak plank and a set of chisels. They asked Olivia and Emma for permission to carve a small addition on the ridge beam. And beneath Josiah Crane's final words, they cut a new line, told by the twins who gave his wood a home. Silverton remembers. That plank became the first piece of a memorial that would grow over the coming months. But the full story of how a cursed house and an orphaned message redeemed an entire town, and how that redemption rippled far beyond the borders of Silverton, was only just beginning. The winter of 1885 to 1886 broke slowly, reluctantly, as if the cold was unwilling to release the land it had held for so many months. But by late March, the snow began to retreat from the valley floor. The aspen buds unfurled in pale green. The creek swelled with meltwater. and Silverton emerged from the White Siege a changed town, not simply because the roofs had collapsed or the stock had frozen, but because the truth had finally thawed. The carving on the ridge beam of the twins' cabin had done what sermons and shame could not. It had made Josiah Crane real. Not a ghost, not a curse, but a man who had died forgiving those who killed him. The first official act of the spring was not the repair of the schoolhouse. It was a town meeting held in the open air, beneath the same aspen trees where the gallows had once cast its shadow. Reverend McAllister, his voice thin and worn from the long winter, stood before the gathered families and read aloud a resolution drafted by Mr. Burgess and signed by the remaining members of the town council. The resolution acknowledged the wrongful execution of Josiah Crane on March 22, 1874. It declared his name cleared of all charges, and it directed that a permanent marker be placed at the site of the old gallows, bearing the words of his forgiveness. When the Reverend finished reading, no one cheered. There was only silence and then a single sound, old Mr. Teller, weeping without shame. The memorial that followed was unlike anything Silverton had ever built. Not a statue to a general or a plaque to a wealthy donor, but a simple archway of local stone that stood at the edge of the field where the gallows timber had once been stacked. At its center, they placed a polished granite slab inscribed with Josiah Crane's words, "Let this wood be a witness. Let it stand long after I am gone. Let it be warm for someone." And beneath those words a new line. It was. The orphan twins of Silverton, Olivia and Emma, made it so. The dedication ceremony was small. Just the twins, Mrs. Hemlock, and a few of the families who had spent those 3 nights trapped inside the cabin. But as the stone was lowered into place, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in what felt like weeks, and even the most skeptical could not deny that something had shifted in the air. The cabin itself remained the true monument, not just a building, but a living archive of the winter that had changed everything. Olivia and Emma lived in that house for the rest of their lives, and they never once considered leaving it. Emma finally hung the bright yellow curtain she had dreamed of, and the sunlight catching them through the single window made the room feel larger than its 12 by 16 feet. Olivia built a second shelf for her books, and then a third, until one whole wall held the collection of stories and medical texts that she traded for mending work. The ridge beam stayed exposed, never covered, never hidden. Visitors who came to see the famous carving would have to duck their heads and climb onto the crate table, just as Olivia had done that first frozen night. But the most surprising visitor arrived nearly 40 years later in the autumn of 1925. The twins were old women by then, their hair silver and their hands gnarled from decades of work. Emma's husband, a gentle schoolteacher named William, had died the previous spring. Olivia had never married, saying once that she had married the cabin itself and found it a faithful partner. On a crisp October afternoon, a stranger knocked on the door. He was a man in his mid-30s, thin and tired in the way that Josiah Crane had once been tired, with eyes that carried a familiar weight. His name was Thomas Crane. He was Josiah's nephew, born 3 years after his uncle was hanged, raised on stories of an innocent man who had vanished into the territories and never returned. For 20 years, Thomas had been tracing the last steps of his uncle's life, guided by the letters of the nun from St. Mary's and the scattered records of a dozen frontier towns. He had found the walking stick. He had found the priest who had taken Silas Trut's confession. And now, at last, he had found the wood. Thomas Crane stood in the small cabin beneath the ridge beam that had once held his uncle's final hours. He read the carving that Olivia had uncovered half a lifetime ago. He read the addition the town had chiseled beneath it. And then he sat down on the crate table and wept into his hands while the 2 old women who had built a home from Gallows lumber made him tea and waited in silence. Before he left, Thomas gave them a photograph, the only known image of Josiah Crane, taken in a St. Louis studio before he had gone west. It showed a young man with a solemn face and hands that looked capable of hard work. Olivia hung it on the wall beside the ridge beam, so that the face and the words would face each other forever. The The story of the Orphan twins and the Gallows would spread far beyond Silverton in the decades that followed. A writer from a Denver newspaper visited in 1902 and wrote a long article that was reprinted in papers across the country. A traveling preacher used the story in his sermons, calling it proof that redemption was not only possible but demanded. Even the territorial governor, on a visit to the mountain towns in 1908, made a point of stopping at the cabin, stepping inside, and reading the carving for himself. He reportedly emerged with wet eyes and ordered that the record of Josiah Crane's conviction be formally expunged. But perhaps the truest legacy of the cursed house was not in the headlines or the official records. It was in the way Silverton itself changed. The same men who had once refused to sell flour to the twins now sent their daughters to learn midwifery from Olivia. The blacksmith, Gideon Welker, never apologized with words, but the spring after the great blizzard, he appeared at the cabin door with a new claw hammer and a set of nails, laid them on the step without a word, and walked away. The town that had been built on mining and rough justice slowly became a town that told stories about what it had done wrong and what it had done to make it right. The memorial arch became a gathering place for weddings, not out of forgetfulness but out of a shared understanding that even the worst ground could be reclaimed. The cabin itself, the warmest little house in town, remained standing. Through new storms and new winters the dense oak held. The roof never buckled, the walls never warped, and the ridge beam, that heavy piece of gallows timber that had once supported a dying man's weight, continued to bear its load without complaint. Twins who had been given $3 and a field of cursed lumber had built something that outlasted every other structure in Silverton. They had not known they were building a memorial. They had simply needed a home. But in doing so, they had given a town back its soul. And the question that still lingers in that small room, beneath the old oak beam, is not whether the wood was ever cursed. It is what it asks of us when we are given something meant to be thrown away, and choose instead to make it warm. The cabin still stands, not as a museum, not as a restored relic behind glass, but as a house, lived in, breathed in, warmed by the same old oak that once held the weight of an innocent man. The ridge beam with its carved forgiveness still spans the ceiling, and if you climb onto the crate table and hold a lamp close, you can read every word. Time has darkened the letters, but it has not erased them. Time rarely does. Olivia and Emma are long gone, but their names are spoken in Silverton like the names of founders, not because they built the biggest house or held the highest office, but because they saw worth in what everyone else had thrown away. $3, a field of cursed lumber, a town's buried guilt. They took all of it and built something warm. In doing so, they forced a community to face what it had done and gave it a chance to begin again. The story of the Orphan twins and the Gallows wood is not really about superstition or physics, though both played their part. It is about the choices we make when we inherit something broken. The wood could have rotted in that field forever. The truth about Josiah Crane could have stayed locked in a forgotten file. The twins could have accepted the town's judgment and frozen to death in their lean-to, victims of a curse they never earned. Instead, they looked at a pile of planks that everyone else was afraid to touch and saw a roof. They saw a future. How many times do we walk past something labeled cursed, a past mistake, a shameful memory, a piece of ourselves or our history that we would rather leave in a field to rot, and fail to see what it might become? The twins' story suggests that the line between a curse and a gift is sometimes only the angle from which you look. The wood did not change. Its density, its strength, its grain were there all along. What changed was the hands that took it up. Josiah Crane's final request was not for vengeance. It was for warmth. Not just physical warmth, but the warmth of being remembered, of being believed, of having his name spoken without fear. He asked that his would be a witness, and for more than 100 years it has been. Every fire that burned in that small hearth, every meal cooked, every child born beneath that roof was an answer to his prayer. He wanted someone to tell the truth, and two orphan girls with $3 and nothing to lose finally did. The house built from Gallows lumber became the warmest little house in town, not in spite of its origins, but because of them. The very thing that made it cursed in the eyes of the superstitious, the dense, old-growth oak chosen for a gallows, was what made it hold heat better than any pine cabin on the frontier. The curse and the blessing were the same property, waiting for someone to see it differently. As the winter of that first year finally loosened its grip and Silverton rebuilt, a quiet understanding settled over the town. They had been given something terrible, a wrongful execution, a lie carried for 11 years, and they had turned away from it. But the twins, with their stubborn courage and their refusal to be afraid of a beam of wood, had turned back toward it. They had read the writing on the wall, quite literally, and refused to let it disappear. In redeeming the wood, they redeemed the town. Thomas Crane left Silverton with a photograph of his uncle and a small piece of oak that Olivia had saved from the offcuts, a scrap no bigger than his hand. He carried it back to his family, and it became their most treasured possession. Not because it was valuable, but because it was proof that even the most unjust death could lead to something lasting. The wood had been a witness, just as Josiah had hoped. What do we do with the things we are told are cursed? The memories we bury, the histories we refuse to examine. The answer might be simpler than we think. Pick them up. Look at them in the light. And if they are solid, build something warm. The warmest little house in town was never a miracle. It was a choice, repeated day after day, by two girls who refused to let fear make their decisions. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about what we throw away and what we might reclaim, then subscribe now. There are countless other stories hidden in the cracks of history, waiting for someone to hold up a light and read the words. We'll be here to tell them.